Welcome to day 2 of the 2020 Summer Series. I'm Connor Martindale, a mentor with the Robot Dolphins, and today we're going to be starting off with the Scouting and Strategy panel brought to you by Team 5199. Following this panel, which will end at 5:40, we will have a presentation on machining with Teams 3476 Code Orange and the Robot Dolphins. They'll be covering the various ways they incorporate CNC milling and routing into their builds. The machining presentation will run until 6:25, and at 6:30, experts from Team 3309, Firebots, are going to be ending out the day with a presentation on the uses of fasteners in FRC. In case you missed us yesterday, the way this works is that during this panel, we ask that if you have any questions about scouting, match strategy, or season strategies, to please post them in the YouTube chat so that our experts can get to your questions right away during the presentation. While you're all typing your questions, let's get started with some introductions for our panelists. Take it away, Teddy.
Of course, I'm muted. Hi, I'm Teddy Bullicus, a strategy and scouting mentor, as well as the former drive coach for Robot Dolphins. My team calls me Strapmaster, but you may know me as a skinny 7-foot legend that wears zip ties on his safety glasses and tears off his pants to reveal stylish short shorts at competitions.
Hi, I'm Ollie Aruji, the strategy lead on Team 5199 for the upcoming year, as well as the team president.
Hi, I'm Caden Davis, the current scouting lead for 5199. I've been learning under Connor and Teddy for a few years now, and I'm always seen at competitions with a clipboard or on a phone call.
All right, and those are our panelists. So while we wait for you guys to type your questions into the YouTube chat, we're going to go ahead and get started with some questions that we organized beforehand. So first of all, I'm going to come to Ali with this first question. In terms of your overall season strategy, how do you balance between your strategy team and your design team throughout the season and especially at kickoff?
So for our team as a whole, as you know, strategy and design play hand in hand with each other at the beginning on kickoff day and just that first week in general. Our whole strategy team and our whole team in general is just constantly going through the game manual, constantly reading everything and watching the match videos and pretty much trying to put together what we want our goals to be for the season. We, like many other teams, create a want, need, and desire kind of column for each of the things that we'll need in a robot for the whole season. And that plays a lot of the role in how we end up designing the robot. We always want to prioritize what scores the most points, and as a strategy team, that's what most of our work is going into a new season. Identifying what we want to devote our time and energy to and what's going to have the most benefit for us as a whole. Like the past couple of years, we've always been emphasizing on the end game because we've identified that that's like the easiest, most consistent ways to get a lot of points. And because of that, we always make sure we put extra effort into our climbers. And a lot of the design and strategy talk that you were talking about comes in the weeks like 2 and 3 of the season when we're working a lot on prototyping and starting up the CAD. Our strategy members are pretty much always on the shop, always being asked questions, and that kind of leads us to success later on in the season with our robot design.
Alrighty.
To expand on that a little bit, one of the main things that we do as a strategy team is we kind of compare the point scoring and the difficulty of each task in game to try and preemptively figure out how we think the game is going to be played. Like in our current game, Infinite Recharge, you guys remember that the color wheel wasn't really a major factor. We kind of determined that before the season, and in doing so, we didn't devote that much time or resources to making a color wheel manipulator. So we focused on what would be most helpful for our robot.
And to kind of give another example, 2019, we kind of had a similar approach. We knew that picking up and cargo and hatch panels were going to be really, really important for the speed of the game and the amount of points we scored. Because of that, we made sure to devote a lot of time onto the pickup mechanisms, especially, to make sure we can have a good basis to go forwards in the remainder of the season.
Alrighty, so now we have our first question from the chat from Rick and Ali. How much time do you dedicate to drive practice versus optimizing your robot? Where's your cutoff point?
So pretty much for us, ideally, we'd want to give at least 2 weeks at the end of the season to work purely on the robot to just start drive practice. Because it's really, really important for us for drivers to be comfortable with the robot. Although they do have practice using like the off-season robot, driving that around, even while we're in season, it's a completely different situation to be on the robot that you will be using on competitions. The past 3 years, what we've been doing to kind of compromise on this matter a little bit more is to create a practice robot to use purely for driving practice for our driver, especially when bag day was a thing. And even now that bag days got taken away, this is the same thing we did this year to make sure that we don't really wear down our actual competition robot too much. But for us, again, it comes down to the season, comes down to how many things there are to juggle, but overall we prioritize driving very, very greatly, although it doesn't always end up that way.
Alrighty, and I have another question, this time for Caden. How do you decide between wants and needs on the robot?
So this kind of comes back to what I was talking about before with comparing like the reward versus the effort of completing certain tasks. We use that info to determine what we need to have if we want to stay at a competitive level. As Ali said, during 2019, we determined that being able to do both hatches and balls was necessary for competitive robot. So we put that in need. We determined that having a consistent climber, because the end game was worth so many points, would go in need, but having a fast climber, which would be very nice and would make us a lot better, it wasn't really necessary. So we put that under want. So we kind of rank it like that. Like, if we need this to be a competitive robot, it goes under need. If it would help us to be a competitive robot, it goes under want.
Alrighty, thank you. And as more people are joining in, if you have any questions at home that you would like to ask any of the people currently on, make sure to comment them down below so we can answer them. So now we have a question for Ali. How do you prepare for an alliance meeting before a match?
So what we tend to do ourselves as a team is our drive coach, probably one other member of the strategy team, as well as our driver, would always, well before the match would start, go over and talk with the other two alliances. We'd send a representative, designate a meeting place at one of our pits, and have all the team strategy individuals come over and talk. During that meeting, a lot of strategy is involved, and we usually like to take the lead in it. This past year, we had whiteboards that I highly recommend you have with the field map on them. And what we use those for is to designate where we start, where we're going, and to kind of designate different zones for each team. Because in the past, especially 2019, we had issues with robots interfering, robots bumping in and kind of like defending our own team. And because of that, we like the method of using different zones, and that would allow the different robots in charge of that zone to score and defend in that particular area. And that would kind of lead to success later on. And additionally, we'd also kind of talk amongst ourselves to see who's like the best scorer and best robot on that area, on our alliance, and kind of play around that. But also a big part is talk about the opposing alliance. Caden can give a bit more info on how we use data to kind of manage what we do and how big of a role like defense or our aggression kind of varies based on the other team.
So when we gather data from our stand scouts, one of the most important things for the strategy team is just the most basic, simple statements about the other robots on the team for the alliance that we play against or are playing with in the next match. For example, the robot broke, it caught on fire, it started smoking. Something like that is critical information that is conveyed really simply from our stand scouts. Stand scout data can also tell you important things like, oh, the next team is one main scoring robot who is seeded second and has been having the highest point output and then 2 defense bots that aren't extremely effective, then we could know from that where to put our defense bot, and we would naturally put it on that very high scoring enemy robot. So just even the most simple stuff, such as defense, quality of robots, and who is able to do what, is very important data that you can get from your stand scouts.
And a big role that the drive coach has in all of this is making sure that whatever's talked about in the meeting beforehand continues throughout the whole match. A lot of times when you're on the stage and playing the match out, teams tend to like forget what was discussed beforehand. So usually our drive coach does a really good job in making sure that other teams stay with a plan and kind of have a strategy moving forward.
All right, so our next question is coming from Eli Uva in the YouTube chat, and he asks, how do you go about picking your drive team? So Teddy, as a previous drive coach, why don't you go into the idea that we have behind that a little bit for us?
Alrighty. So our general philosophy is, first of all, you need a drive coach, because the drive coach is kind of like the glue that holds the whole thing together. Because in general, the way we see our drive team is, I'm not muted, right? Okay, cool. So we have the drive coach, and they are the ones, the voice that the operator and the driver listen to on the field. Because in past years, we had issues where we were the coach said one thing, and there was so much noise that the driver didn't do that, and it cost us some points and possibly the match. So we try and emphasize that the drive coach is the main body in the main vessel of voice for the drive team. And so that usually goes to a position of someone who knows the strategy, someone who's been on the strategy team for several years, like myself or Connor or some of my other panelists like Oli. And then from there, we don't go strictly based off skill. We go more off dedication. Like if you're in the shop, 40 hours a week, you're there every day, you're building the robot, then you should have the chance to drive the robot at competitions. If you go in maybe once or twice in the season, and then you show up the week before a competition and say, hey, I'd like to try and drive the robot at the competition, that's not exactly the best way to go about it, because you need to have time to train them. And same thing with the operator. Usually we have someone on the operator who mainly the intake, in main intake games like in 2018 and 2019, where it's very centered around the intake and not so much as like passing things through the robot like in 2020. So people who work on the intake more know more about it and are able to work with it more. So generally that's how we do it. And when you have a drive team, you always have to have a programmer. And if the driver and the operator and neither of them are programmers, that's how we fill our technician. Because if there's any type of software problem, you got to have a technician, got to have a programmer. In this case, in our case, usually the technician to help solve those problems. So next, we have a question from Terry Wells that says, what specific steps do you follow to convert the game manual into a well-considered strategy? You mentioned discussions and need, want, desire, but we struggle taking the next step to final strategy. So Connor, would you like to offer some input on that?
Yeah, so obviously it all starts off on kickoff day when you get access to the game manual, right? So the first thing that we all do as a team is read through the game manual together. We use, I can't remember what their number is off the top of my head, but this year we started using another team's, what is it called? I think it's like the game manual quiz or something. So we all had everybody go through the rule manual together. Then we all went through the quiz together to make sure there wasn't anything that, people were confused about or that people just missed, or even that our whole team missed. So that definitely helps us all kind of be on the same page. In terms of going into a well-considered strategy from then on, our whole strategy doesn't do a whole lot at the beginning, aside from our robot design strategy in terms of like match play. We usually try to start covering that once we get closer to the season starting, once we start knowing what our robot is actually going to be able to do. As for the needs, wants, and desires, that's a really good plan that we use for just kind of signaling out, okay, do we want rank points or do we want normal points in order to win the match? Do we want to climb or do we want to score more points? Like, which things do we want to focus on? And we kind of just all talk about it as a team until we eventually come up with something that, one, we all agree on, and two, we think from a design philosophy is actually going to be possible for us to do. And then as for taking the next step to final strategy, I would say that it really just comes down to seeing what can your robot do? You know, once it's all said and done and you've built it, what can you do? What do you struggle with? What do you need help with? And that really gives us kind of our, I guess, plan once we go into matches of what we want to do, what we want our alliance partners to do, what we don't want our opposing alliance to do, all that kind of stuff.
Oh, just one thing I want to add for that. Be realistic with yourself and your alliance about what your robot is capable of. Because a lot of the times, just being able to like know for sure that you can do something rather than, oh, we scored 10 points one time in practice, but we've been averaging around 6. Say you've been averaging around 6 so you can play around what your team does like well. Because you don't want to go in with a series of expectations for a match and then have it all like crash because it wasn't as realistic as it could have been. Because no one's going to be mad at you for not having a robot that can do everything, as long as they know what it can do and you can work around that. It's a lot of like resource management when it comes to creating your strategy for a match.
As an example of that, at Del Mar this year, our shooter wasn't working 100% how we wanted it to. So we didn't go in saying like, oh yeah, we're going to score, 30 balls and then have an amazing auton, climb, win every match. We were telling our alliance partners, we don't know. So they knew that it's kind of to plan for it. It's not that way. They're not banking on something that we don't even have faith in. So we want to like have a alley of trust between each other. Like, okay, yeah, we know for sure this is going to work. And then this part is a little iffy. So now we have another question from Angel. Do any of your teams use an app to record data for the scouts, Caden?
So in previous years, we have done this paper and pencil, having students fill out scouting sheets and then put those into a big binder. This year, though, we transitioned to electronic scouting. We didn't use a specific like custom app for scouting. We made a Google form that students could fill out on their phones, though. For setting up that Google form, one of the nice things about it is that it has very easy integration with Microsoft Excel. Microsoft Excel. So from there, you can do a lot of advanced kind of data processing, I'd say, on all the input that you gather, and that can help you glean further insights. And that's kind of why we made the switch.
All right.
Go ahead, Teddy. Yeah.
Make sure to comment your questions below if you have any. Connor.
What Caden was saying real quick, I had some trouble unmuting my mic for a second, so I wasn't able to jump right in there. But again, with this year, as Caden mentioned, we just started going to like fully digital, which I think overall was a pretty big success. And we really liked the way it worked out because it really forced us to kind of focus on, okay, what do we actually want to report? Because when you're doing it on Google Forms, there's a lot that you're not really able to, when you're doing it on Google Forms, there's not, oh my goodness. There's a lot that you're not actually able to record as if you were on pen and paper. For example, what we used to do is we used to draw out the robot that you're scouting, their path, so that when it came to playoffs, you'd be able to see, okay, where do they like to play the game? Like, do they like to play on the far side, the close side, in the middle of the arena, stuff like that. And it really forced us to say, okay, do we actually need that information? Are we actually looking at that? The short answer is no, we weren't. And a lot of our scouts are kind of frustrated with having to do it. So they were really thankful that they didn't have to do that anymore. So a big part of the online thing that we use, and something that Google Forms is really nice about, is that it's so simple and it is a little bit limited, but it really forces you to think about, okay, what do we actually want and what do we need to look at during the competition? Our next question is going to be coming from the YouTube chat as well. This is from Jay Bullock, who says, how do you decide your pick list for playoffs? So Caden, why don't you start us off with this one? Caden, you're muted. Yeah.
I start trying to form my pick list towards the end of the first day of qualifiers. And that gives you the entire second day to kind of refine your choices. But usually with the pick list, if you start it at the end of the first day, you are able to meet with kind of the rest of the strategy team and the other scouts to get input on that pick list. In terms of actually deciding where robots should go on that pick list, you kind of consider what robots would be able to be on a team with you without interfering with your gameplay, and that would complement your gameplay. For an example, as Teddy said earlier, during Del Mar, our shooter was not very functional. So we made it a priority that our first pick was a robot that excelled in that department so that they could kind of make up for our shortcoming there. Also, we wanted a robot that could climb with us without interfering with us. Then for your second pick, you have a bit more limited of a selection, but what you want to try to do is to shore up any kind of gaps in the team. Like, let's say your robot can climb, but your first pick, even though they're really good, they can't climb. Then it would probably be optimal for your second pick to be able to climb. So you kind of have to analyze it not only as just, here is the first pick I want, here is the second pick I want. You have to consider, if I have this first pick, what second pick robot would kind of complement that team? And all of this kind of applies even if you aren't in the top 8. Like, let's say you are the first pick, then you are still needed to share that data with the first pick, or with the captain team, on how to choose a second pick that would complement both of you guys.
Like Kaden was saying, a lot of that also depends on like the game. Like for 2020, for example, you really don't want to have like 3 tall robots, because if that happens, you won't really end up using your trench run at all, which is one of the most valuable like zones in the whole game. Because of that, it's really nice to have at least 1 trench bot or even 2 to be able to maneuver in that zone. Or like looking at 2018, for example, some would be like, oh, we don't need our third robot to be able to do the scale at all. But in some areas, teams identified that like the top teams were so strong in the scale that in the Auton that they wouldn't really be able to do anything. Because of that, what we ended up doing at Worlds was we had all 3 of our robots at the very beginning of the match immediately do the scale. Doing that allowed us to kind of offset the Auton balance and actually have us winning on that front. Because of that, it's really, really important to have that idea in your head before you go in, because otherwise that position would never be able to happen, and you would never be able to win that match if the robots just weren't able to do what you needed them to do. So you just really need to like think in advance in that regards.
Yeah, a huge part of making the pick list is just making sure that everybody's involved, because some issues that we had in the past, like for example, when I was first starting on the team, I was kind of the only person involved with our scouting and like our pick list, and it just kind of all fell on one person. So it was really hard to get a big picture of the event, whereas what we're doing now is we're having all of our scouters. We have 2 scouting leads, and Caden, for example, takes the primary responsibility for making the pick list, but we have another scouting lead who helps him with that. And all of our scouts are giving input. Our drive coach is giving input. Our drive team is giving input. Anybody who saw anything is giving input to just kind of make sure that we actually are seeing everything from every angle instead of getting the limited perspective of one person. And I'll speak from experience in saying that doing it yourself is a really bad idea. You make mistakes. I made a lot of really bad mistakes in some of the teams that I picked. We ended up having a lot of fun and still doing well, but I definitely got some questions afterwards like, hey, why'd you pick that team? And I realized, oh yeah, there were better options. But so yeah, just try to be involved with the rest of your team as much as you can, and just make it a whole like team effort. Even try talking to the teams that you want to pick. Just say, hey, if we were to pick you guys, A, would you say yes? B, is there another team that you'd want to work with? Why would you want to work with them? Stuff like that. So just reach out to other people. Our next question comes from Tiara, who says, how often do you switch out scouts during your competition? So Ollie, I'll give you this one first.
So yeah, a big thing that we do is we have 1 scout for each of the robots on the field. This is a way we do to keep track. And so this is how we kind of base what scout does what robot, because I know a lot of teams get confused when that comes up. We assign based off the starting positions. So each of the scouts is assigned to a starting position on the field, whether it's red 1, red 2, red 3, blue 1, blue 2, blue 3. And how we do that is from then on, we tend on, depending on how many people we have at the event, we kind of shuffle through everyone to make sure everyone gets a break. And we don't want to make it like a drooling task on anyone in particular. And we also sometimes switch out people going on pit scouting runs or staying on sand scout to kind of like make sure it doesn't become a too repetitive and a grueling of a task, because we really rely on our scouters as a team, and we want to make sure that they are all like more or less like happy with doing what they're doing. Caden, if you have anything else to add on that.
To kind of add on to how to make the scouts kind of enjoy scouting, is you want scouting to almost feel secondary to actually watching the game. They should not be spending the entire time frantically writing, but they should just write down like key input, key factors that will help us like actually with our data. One way I've personally found to get scouts more engaged is when you collect your scouting sheet, or now this year when everyone submits, I just have them tell me in one like brief sentence how the robot did. Like, all right, cool. How did the robot do? And they will respond with something like, it broke, it stayed on the platform the whole time. Or they could respond, it scored 8 balls, it was really fast, and the drivers looked really competent. Just something like that, directly communicating with one of the leads lets them really feel like what they're doing is actually being valued and actually contributing to the team's decisions and the team's success. Just to make it feel like they aren't wasting their time with it.
Alrighty. So if you have any questions during this stream, make sure to comment them down below. We have another stream question here from Suvan. How would you set expectations that challenge the team, but also are realistic? Ollie?
So that was a thing we actually like kind of struggled with this past season, 2020. Going into the season, we were like, okay, we're going to do a tall robot. It seems to be the easier option. It seems to be the more reliable and consistent one. And we were like, it'll do good enough to be competitive. As we saw a lot of highly competitive tall robots we're seeing at different competitions in the 2 weeks that we had competitions. But kind of 2 weeks, 3 weeks into the season, we started having a lot of conversation on the topic of, should we go tall or should we go trench? And that eventually made us completely switch 360 on that, with everyone unanimously agreeing on switching over to doing a trench bot. That would be far more difficult. Having to have more accurate like spacing or hopper design and all that would have to be completely changed. But we agreed to go for the leap because we decided that the benefits of going trench would far outweigh the cons of doing it. Being able to do just constant runs under the trench would be able to prevent any defense from being able to kind of shut us down. We saw a lot of teams in 2019. They did great like the first 4 weeks of competitions. But then like week 5 and 6, and even at Worlds, they were having a lot of issues because they weren't used to playing around defense, like high caliber defense robots. And that's what we wanted to make sure not to happen, especially with the climb zone having those 1-inch bumps off the ground. We want to make sure there's no tipping, there's no issues with any of that. So just doing a trench run for us was worth the risk. And even though we cut it very close with our timing, I think we're all happy that we went with that decision.
Yeah, so that decision ended up being something that, as Oli mentioned, was something that was really heavily debated for those first couple of weeks. And the expectation we set at the beginning of the build season was that, okay, we're going to have a tall robot. We're going to be done building it like week 4, something crazy like that. And then we're going to have a ton of drive practice. Like we're just going to be super on top of everything, going really fast. And then that decision to switch over when we realized from a design and strategy perspective, not only could we do it, but also that we wanted to do it, was something that really made this year challenging for our team. And looking back on it, we probably, we were right up to the wire with finishing our robot, and we had a lot of issues at our first competition. So looking back on it, we probably wouldn't want to do something like that in the future and set, like you're mentioning in the question, an expectation that's a little bit more realistic, because switching your entire robot design like 2-3 weeks in or whatever it ended up being was a huge strain on our team. And it was a really rough time trying to get that together. So we really this year, at least, especially this year with the modified game rules, we're going to be definitely trying to do something that we can really see, okay, even if we do need to change it, we can still make this plan work. I believe that's it for our YouTube questions right now. So we're going to go and head back to our questions that we have prepared already. So again, if you have any questions for any of our panelists, please put them in the YouTube chat. We'll be here for about another 9 minutes before we start getting ready with the next panel. So without further ado, Caden, I'm going to ask you to talk to us a little about how our scouting system works. Explain to us kind of what we do for scouting, what we've maybe tried in the past, what you like about what we're currently doing, any advice you have in terms of creating your scouting system.
So we kind of divided scouting into two main groups, our pit scouts and our stand scouts. They're largely the same people, but we kind of use pit scouting as a way to get people out of the stands just as a break almost. Granted, pit scouting is still very important, but pit scouting is most beneficial for finding major flaws in certain teams' robots that help us be better prepared, like knowing a robot just can't shoot into high goal. Well, we kind of use stand scouting for measuring the robot's actual in-match performance. For our scouting system, we try to make it a mix of qualitative and quantitative data. So for qualitative, we could be just how skilled were their drivers? Did they have efficient routing and scoring? Well, quantitative would be something like how many power cells did they score? We kind of funnel all of this data first into the scouting lead, and then that data is communicated to our coach and strategy team. In terms of what we choose to track, we kind of shift it throughout the season. Like last year, we had a different scouting sheet for each competition. We try to focus our questions so that we can get a more complete picture of robot performance than you could get just from the numbers or just from kind of statements. Yeah, we want to record things that help to measure the effect that their robot had on the game and anything that would help us compare that robot to the other robots. Some example things that we almost always measure are the game pieces scored, defense and their defensive skill, climbing in terms of both speed and consistency and ability to pair with other climbers, their in general driving speed, their driving skill, and then their weight/ability to be pushed around by defense.
Alrighty.
Yeah, I suppose that's kind of the basic introduction to our scouting system.
Thank you. Oli, can you explain a little bit more about how we do pit scouting?
Yeah, for sure. So pretty much something that I personally have seen a lot from what other teams do, because I'm usually around in the pits and having people come up and ask questions, is a lot of people focus on that like quantitative data, like Caden was saying, on their pit scouts. They go around asking, oh, how many points can you score? How much of this can you do? But more of that data is better gotten from the sand scouts. You can get a much better grasp of it coming from that sort, because a lot of times teams have a different result in their practice rather than what they actually end up doing on the field. And usually the first round of matches where you don't really have any data isn't a big enough reason to kind of rely on that pit scout data, because it's most of the time not as accurate as your stand scout data. But the area where pit scouting really comes in through is identifying what the robots have, like Caden briefly mentioned. Identifying if they have, say, Neo motors versus Sims. Just basic stuff like that can show us what a robot can do, like in defense or just in brute like power. Sometimes, like when you get especially to your like third robot or like second pick of the alliance, it's really important to make sure that you have the robot, because that's a lot of time the robot actually decides who wins the game and who loses. It's really important to decide and look through every single factor, and a lot of time pit scouting does have a role in that. Another thing that we started adopting from some other top-level teams that we saw do at Worlds was to get pit scout data of the other teams' like resources. So a lot of times they'd ask about how many batteries they had or other questions along those lines. Because a lot of times once you get to finals, some of the teams that don't have as many resources their batteries tend to die or their system kind of falls apart under pressure. So a lot of times those type of questions can come in very handy because you know that, we need to give them a couple of our batteries maybe if we get to finals with this team. Just having those type of data points on file is very important, and those are things that you'd never be able to get just from your stand scouting.
Yeah, I'm seeing a few questions from the chat just about pit scouting in general, so I just want to address those really quick. What the point of pit scouting is for our team and how it works is that we'll have a group of people, either 2 people at a time in a pair or individuals going around, and basically you talk to every single team, or you talk to 20 teams, another pair talks to another 20 teams until you've talked to every team in the competition. You're really just looking for qualitative data about the team, about their robot, anything that you think could be useful. We don't really do like a scoring system, so it doesn't factor in a huge amount into, for example, ranking the teams among each other when we're creating our pick list, but it does give us a lot of insight into, okay, these teams are scoring about the same, but this team is using an 8-wheel drive with more powerful motors or something, so they're going to be a little bit stronger against getting pushed around in defense, so they might be able to shoot from outside of the trench without being bothered too much, whereas a team with maybe a 6-wheel drive and weaker drive motors wouldn't be able to do that, and they'd want to sit inside the trench where they can't be touched. So we're looking for, again, qualitative data that just kind of tells you things about the robot that you might not be able to see during stand scouting. For example, during stand scouting, depending on where you're sitting it can be really hard to see the robots clearly and see things like, how does their climber work? How does their intake work? How does their, whatever mechanisms they have, how does it work? With this pit scouting, you're able to see exactly how these mechanisms work and what they do. And you can kind of judge, okay, is this mechanism going to be something that we want to rely upon heavily in a playoffs position? Or do we think, I don't know about that design. It looks like it might break or something. This might not be a team that we want to pick because I'm scared about that happening. So that's just kind of the stuff that we're looking for during pit scouting. Before we move on to the next question from the chat, does anyone else want to add to that, or are we good to go?
I'll just add on real quick. Pit scouting in general is just so that way people can see essentially what the other teams are doing. Because a lot of people who are doing the scouting, like Caden said, they're also doing stand scouting, and they may not know what other strategies do teams use to accomplish the same goal. And so it gives a chance for people to go around and to see different robots and how other teams accomplish the goal. So it's an insight to give you inspiration too into that's a unique and interesting way to solve that problem. If we have that in the future, we could try doing something like that. And so since we're running low on time, we'll get to our final question. This is from Stuart from the chat. How are you communicating between all locations at the comp, between the stands, pits, and practice field? What is the most efficient way to mass communicate quickly? And I'll give this one to Ollie.
It depends on the situation, honestly. If we're asking for scouting data from the stands, we usually just bring them up and call them because that's the most accurate way to make sure they see our notification and they actually respond. That'll result in them either coming down and talking to us or just texting over the information. If we want information to be sent to a bunch of people, say everyone, someone go over and reserve us a practice field spot at this time. Or make sure all scouters keep a close eye on this match. Something along those lines. We always use Remind as it sends it out to the whole team. And that allows everyone to be able to know. So in case, say 3 people aren't on their phones, aren't looking at it, someone else will be able to see and notify them. So it's a lot of, if you haven't used Remind, I highly recommend using it for your team. And that's kind of what we've been using the past 3 or 4 seasons. And it's helped out a lot in communication. Otherwise, just feel free to call people. Texting is great and all, but it's just sometimes it doesn't get noticed as easily.
All right, so we're just about out of time. There's one more question from the YouTube chat. This is going to be the last one that we get to, and we're going to answer it real quickly and then transition over to our next, I believe it's a workshop that's next. Dana asked, what skills do you think are important for a scouter to have? So, Kate, why don't you give us a brief idea of your ideal scouter?
My ideal scouter, first of all, they are actually interested in what the robots are doing and how the game is played, because then they'll be more attuned to like seeing what data is actually important in terms of qualitative data, especially. They won't write something like the robot was fast. They'll write something that gives us a lot more insight into how the robot played. Another thing, I suppose, for a scouter to have would be they know how to communicate, because if they just kind of see something, write it down, even if it's something really important, they just write it down, that kind of goes to waste, at least somewhat. We want them, if they notice something actually important, then they will definitely communicate that to us right away, get us the most important information that we need.
All right, and that is going to do it for our scouting and strategy panel. Before we head out, I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today. This was really great. I hope this was insightful for everybody watching and gives you a little more into what our team does in particular. Also, feel free to reach out to the Robot Dolphins or any of the other teams, honestly, involved with the summer series. If you have any questions about this, even teams that aren't here on this panel right now, I'm sure they'd be more than happy to help out. And that's going to do it for us.